My best friend asked me to drive across America with him. Everything changed on the last stop. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss a new upload. Every subscription helps us bring more touching, emotional, and unforgettable stories to life. Thank you for supporting our channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. Some journeys don't begin with a destination. They begin with one question you're too afraid to answer. The text from Mason arrived at exactly 6:14 on a gray Tuesday morning while I was balancing a mug of black coffee on a stack of blueprints that had somehow become the entire landscape of my apartment. It was only 7 words long. Drive across America with me. I stared at the screen for a full minute, waiting for another message to appear. A joke, an explanation, a reason. Nothing came. That was the strange thing about Mason Brooks. He could disappear for months without warning and somehow return with a single sentence that made it feel like no time had passed at all. We had been best friends for 11 years, ever since we accidentally ended up sharing the same table during freshman orientation because every other seat had been taken. He spilled iced tea across my notebook before he even learned my name, apologized by buying me lunch, and by the end of the week, everyone assumed we'd known each other our whole lives. Life, however, had a habit of pulling people in different directions. I became a restoration architect, spending my days preserving old buildings that everyone else had forgotten. Mason chased stories instead, traveling from state to state recording sound for nature documentaries, podcasts, and independent films. Sometimes we'd go weeks without speaking. Other times we'd spend 3 hours on the phone arguing about whether roadside diners made better pie than fancy bakeries. Somehow, despite the distance, he remained the first person I wanted to call whenever something good happened, and the only one who could make me laugh after the worst days. I typed the obvious question. Why? 3 dots appeared almost instantly, then disappeared. Another minute passed before his reply arrived. Because I don't want to do it alone. That should have been enough to make me hesitate. I had deadlines, clients, restoration permits waiting for signatures. My calendar looked like someone had attacked it with colored markers. A cross-country road trip made absolutely no sense. Yet as I looked around my apartment, every carefully organized shelf suddenly felt heavier than it had the night before. My life was predictable in all the ways people said adulthood should be. Wake up, work, gym, dinner, sleep, repeat. Safe wasn't the same thing as happy, and somewhere along the way I had forgotten the difference. I called him before I could change my mind. He answered on the first ring. So, he asked, sounding almost annoyingly calm. That's your entire pitch? I said, drive across America with me? Pretty much. You realize normal people include details. He laughed, soft enough that I found myself smiling before I meant to. If I tell you everything now, you'll spend 2 weeks making spreadsheets. I like spreadsheets. Exactly my point. I leaned against the kitchen counter and looked out the window at another perfectly ordinary morning. Cars crawled through the intersection below. Someone walked a golden retriever wearing a tiny blue bandana. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday, and somehow that was the problem. How long? I finally asked. 3 weeks. Maybe 4. Where are we ending? There was a pause just long enough to notice. You'll see when we get there. Every practical instinct told me to say no. Instead, I heard myself asking, when do we leave? Mason didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet relief I couldn't quite place. Tomorrow morning. I'll pick you up at 7. The call ended before I could ask another question. Less than 24 hours later, a weathered dark green SUV rolled to the curb outside my building. Mason leaned out the driver's window wearing faded sunglasses and the same crooked grin that had gotten us into trouble more times than either of us could count. He waved like we were heading across town instead of across an entire country. And as I loaded my duffel bag into the back beside 2 battered camera cases and a cooler packed with snacks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't simply leaving home behind. I was driving toward an answer neither of us was ready to say out loud. The first hour on the road felt strangely ordinary, almost disappointing, as if crossing state lines should have come with dramatic music instead of construction zones and gas station coffee that tasted faintly like burnt cardboard. Mason drummed his fingers against the steering wheel while an old folk playlist filled the SUV with songs we both knew by heart but had not heard in years. He sang every chorus completely off-key without the slightest hint of embarrassment. I pretended to complain, but the truth was I had missed this version of him more than I realized. Somewhere beyond western Pennsylvania, the skyline disappeared behind rolling hills painted in every shade of early autumn. Golden trees crowded the highways, barns leaned peacefully against open fields, and every few miles another hand-painted sign promised the best homemade pie in America. Mason insisted we stop at one that looked as though it had survived 3 generations without changing the wallpaper. The waitress called everyone honey, the coffee mugs did not match, and the apple pie arrived still warm enough to fill the booth with cinnamon before it even touched the table. Mason took one bite, pointed his fork at me, and declared this was officially the new standard by which every future pie would be judged. I reminded him that he had said exactly the same thing outside Columbus 4 years earlier. He shrugged with complete confidence. People are allowed to grow emotionally, Ethan, especially where pie is concerned. We laughed harder than the joke deserved, and for a moment it felt like college again, when we could stretch $20 into an entire weekend and believed every highway led somewhere extraordinary. Back in the SUV, the miles slipped quietly beneath the tires. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes neither of us said anything at all. The silence between us had never been uncomfortable. It carried the easy rhythm of 2 people who had learned long ago that friendship did not always need words. Near sunset, Mason reached into the center console and handed me a disposable camera with faded blue plastic. I turned it over in confusion. I thought you traveled with equipment worth more than my car. He smiled without taking his eyes off the road. Exactly. Which is why I wanted something that cannot be edited. 27 pictures. That is all we get. Make them count. I snapped the first photograph before he could object. His surprised expression froze behind oversized sunglasses just as he burst into laughter. That is going to be terrible, he said. Probably, I admitted. But it is honest. He nodded once, almost thoughtfully, before looking back toward the highway stretching into the orange horizon. As darkness settled around us, we pulled into a small motel tucked beside a family-owned diner with a flickering neon sign. The parking lot was nearly empty except for an aging pickup truck and a motorcycle covered in road dust. While I carried our bags inside, Mason lingered beside the SUV longer than necessary. He stood perfectly still, staring at his phone after it buzzed with another notification. The smile that had followed him throughout the day disappeared so quickly I almost wondered if I had imagined it. By the time I walked back outside, the screen was dark again, and he had already slipped the phone into his jacket pocket. Everything okay? I asked. He looked at me for a heartbeat longer than usual before the familiar grin returned, effortless and carefully placed. Better than okay, he said. We are only getting started. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But somewhere between the fading sunlight and that carefully practiced smile, I began to realize this trip was carrying something far heavier than luggage, and whatever Mason refused to say was traveling with us every single mile. By the 3rd morning, the road had quietly rewritten our routine without asking permission. Mason always woke up first, somehow looking awake before the sun had fully climbed above the horizon, while I stumbled toward the nearest coffee pot with the enthusiasm of a man negotiating with gravity. He claimed my terrible morning attitude was one of the few constants left in the universe. I reminded him that his hair looked like it had lost an argument with a tornado. He bowed dramatically and accepted the criticism as if it were an award. The miles carried us through Ohio and into Indiana, where endless farmland stretched beneath an enormous blue sky that seemed far too big for any photograph to contain. Wind rolled across fields of corn like invisible waves crossing an ocean, and every small town felt suspended in its own quiet rhythm. Mason insisted on stopping whenever he spotted something unusual. A roadside museum dedicated entirely to vintage radios. The world's largest rocking chair. A bookstore hidden inside a renovated train depot. None of these places had appeared on any map I had checked before leaving home, and somehow they became the moments I remembered most. At the bookstore, he disappeared between narrow wooden shelves while I wandered toward a section filled with old travel journals. When I finally found him again, he was smiling at a weathered postcard tucked inside a used novel. He slipped it back exactly where he had found it and closed the cover gently, almost respectfully. I asked what was so interesting. He simply shrugged, and said that sometimes people accidentally leave pieces of themselves behind for strangers to discover. That answer stayed with me much longer than I expected. Later that afternoon, we traded seats, and I took over driving while Mason rested with one arm hanging lazily outside the open window. The warm air carried the scent of fresh grass and distant rain. For nearly an hour, neither of us spoke. Then, without warning, he began naming every ridiculous thing we had done together over the past decade. The camping trip where we forgot the tent poles. The Thanksgiving when we burned frozen rolls because we were arguing about baseball. The apartment where the smoke detector went off every single time I tried to cook pasta. Each memory arrived with so much detail that it felt less like remembering and more like stepping back into another version of ourselves. I realized something quietly unsettling. I could recall almost every important chapter of my adult life by placing Mason somewhere inside it. He had become part of the background of nearly every meaningful memory without either of us ever noticing it happen. That evening, we checked into another modest motel just outside Springfield. The front desk clerk apologized because only one room remained. I started to ask if there was another hotel nearby, but Mason answered before I could finish. One room is fine. We have survived much worse. The room itself was simple, with faded curtains, 2 chairs by the window, and a humming air conditioner that sounded determined to outlive civilization. We picked up takeout from a nearby diner and ate cross-legged on the carpet while watching an old black and white comedy on television with the volume barely loud enough to hear. Mason laughed so hard at one scene that he nearly spilled his fries across the bed. Watching him laugh felt strangely effortless, like breathing after holding my breath for far too long. Much later, after the television had gone dark and the room settled into silence, I noticed a faint glow beneath the blanket on his side of the room. He thought I was asleep. His phone illuminated his face for only a few seconds before he turned it away, read another message, and closed his eyes without replying. The light disappeared, but sleep did not come easily after that. Something was following us across the country, invisible yet impossible to ignore, and with every sunrise it felt as though the distance between us and the truth was becoming shorter than the road ahead. The 4th day greeted us with low clouds hanging over the plains like someone had pulled a gray blanket across the entire sky. A steady drizzle followed us for nearly 50 miles, soft enough that the windshield wipers moved more out of habit than necessity. Mason insisted the weather made every road trip feel more authentic. I argued that authentic was just another word for damp socks and overpriced windshield washer fluid. He laughed. And for a little, while the uneasy feeling that had settled between us over the past 2 days seemed to dissolve into the rhythm of tires humming against wet pavement. By late afternoon, we were somewhere in eastern Colorado, where the highways stretched so straight they looked as though they had been drawn with a ruler. We had just passed a weathered sign advertising the next gas station 20 miles ahead when the engine gave a quiet cough. Then another. A warning light blinked across the dashboard before the SUV slowly lost power. I guided the vehicle onto the gravel shoulder, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The silence was broken only by the ticking sound of the cooling engine and the distant rush of trucks continuing west. Mason climbed out first, hands tucked into his jacket as he peered beneath the hood with complete confidence despite possessing almost no mechanical knowledge whatsoever. I joined him a moment later, and after several minutes of pretending we understood what we were looking at, we both admitted defeat. While waiting for roadside assistance, we decided to reorganize the back of the SUV to make room for the spare equipment that had shifted during the stop. That was when I noticed a small wooden box wedged beneath one of the camera cases. It was old, the corners rounded from years of use, with a leather strap wrapped carefully around it. I looked toward Mason, who had wandered a few yards away to make a phone call. Curious more than anything else, I loosened the strap just enough to lift the lid. Inside were dozens of postcards. Some showed national parks. Others featured tiny towns, mountain overlooks, lighthouses, deserts, and quiet lakes. Every single one had handwriting on the back. My name stared up at me from the first card. Ethan Walker. I froze. I turned it over. The message was short. Saw this place today. You would have loved the old brick courthouse. It reminded me of your restoration projects. Wish you had been here. There was no stamp. No postmark. I reached for another. This one had been written almost 3 years earlier from Oregon. It described the sound of waves crashing against black volcanic rock and ended with a single sentence. I still keep looking for things I want to tell you first. Another card. Another year. Another city. Sometimes the notes were funny. Sometimes thoughtful. Sometimes they described nothing more than the color of the evening sky. None of them had ever been mailed. There had to be at least 50 of them, carefully stacked in chronological order as though they had become a private journal instead of letters. My chest tightened in a way I could not explain. I quickly returned everything exactly as I had found it, just as Mason walked back toward the SUV. His expression looked lighter than it had after the call, but the moment his eyes landed on the wooden box, something flickered across his face. Not anger, not fear, more like the quiet realization that a secret had almost stepped into daylight. He secured the leather strap without saying a word, slid the box gently back beneath the equipment, and gave the side of the SUV an affectionate pat. Funny how we carry things around for years, he said with a faint smile, even when we never figure out where they belong. Before I could ask what he meant, the tow truck appeared over the rise in the highway, its amber lights glowing against the gray afternoon, and whatever answer had almost surfaced disappeared once again beneath the endless road stretching west. The repaired SUV carried us west again as though the unexpected stop had been nothing more than another story to laugh about someday. Yet my thoughts refused to leave the wooden box hidden beneath the camera cases. I never mentioned the postcards, and Mason never brought them up. Instead, we slipped back into the familiar rhythm that had quietly become our new normal. He searched for the best local diners. I judged every cup of coffee with unnecessary seriousness. We filled the disposable camera one careful photograph at a time, refusing to waste a single frame because 27 chances suddenly felt surprisingly precious. By the time we crossed into Utah, the landscape had transformed completely. The endless farmland had given way to towering sandstone cliffs glowing deep red beneath the afternoon sun. The highways curved through canyons that seemed almost unreal, carved by thousands of years that neither of us could truly imagine. Every turn revealed another view that forced us into silence, not because we had nothing to say, but because words seemed too small for places like this. Mason eventually pulled onto a scenic overlook where only 2 other vehicles were parked. The wind carried the dry scent of desert rock, warm earth, and distant sagebrush. We climbed onto a large flat boulder overlooking a valley that stretched for miles in every direction. As the sun drifted lower, shadows slowly painted the cliffs in shades of gold, orange, and purple until the entire desert looked as though it had been lit from within. Mason unpacked sandwiches from the cooler, insisting that every unforgettable view deserved an equally forgettable meal. We laughed while eating grocery store sandwiches that somehow tasted better than expensive restaurant dinners simply because of where we were sitting. After sunset, the temperature dropped quickly, replacing the day's heat with cool desert air. We carried 2 blankets onto the roof of the SUV and lay side by side beneath a sky so crowded with stars that it barely seemed real. I had restored buildings older than my own country, yet nothing I had ever worked on possessed the quiet permanence of that night sky. Mason rested both hands behind his head and pointed toward a faint streak of light crossing the darkness. Satellite, he guessed. I insisted it was a shooting star because it made the story better. He smiled without arguing. We remained there for several minutes listening to nothing except the gentle wind brushing across the desert. Then his voice broke the silence, softer than I had heard it since the trip began. Ethan, can I ask you something strange? I turned toward him. Since when have you needed permission? He kept looking upward instead of meeting my eyes. If one day I was no longer around, how long do you think it would take before you stopped thinking about me? I laughed automatically because the question sounded absurd coming from someone who had spent the last week making jokes about pie, roadside attractions, and my terrible driving. That is not happening, I said. You would probably keep calling me just to complain about coffee wherever you ended up. He chuckled quietly, but it faded almost as quickly as it appeared. Humor me anyway, he said. I took a slow breath before answering honestly. Some people become part of the way you remember your own life. You do not really stop thinking about them because every memory keeps bringing them back. He finally turned toward me. The faint smile on his face carried both gratitude and something I could not quite understand. I wondered if he was about to explain everything. If this was the moment every unanswered question would finally make sense. Instead, He simply looked back at the stars and whispered, "I hoped you would say something like that." The desert fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was waiting. We left the desert behind with red dust still clinging to the tires, but the conversation from the night before stayed with me far longer than the landscape itself. Mason acted as though nothing unusual had happened. He sang along to the radio, argued passionately that every road trip deserved at least one unnecessary detour, and stopped twice simply because he wanted photographs of abandoned roadside signs that everyone else drove past without noticing. Anyone watching us from the outside would have seen two lifelong friends enjoying the freedom of the open road. Only I knew there was now a question quietly echoing beneath every mile we traveled. We crossed into Nevada before turning north through quiet highways where traffic became so rare that several minutes could pass without another vehicle appearing. The silence outside seemed to encourage memories inside the car. Mason reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the disposable camera. There were only a handful of exposures remaining. He looked at the small counter on the top and smiled. Funny how something becomes more valuable the closer it gets to ending. I glanced toward him. "You were talking about the camera, right?" He laughed, but the answer came a fraction too slowly. "Mostly." Around noon, we stopped beside a small lake tucked between low hills where cottonwood trees swayed gently in the breeze. A retired couple sat nearby feeding ducks while a little boy attempted to skip stones across the water with very limited success. Mason watched them with quiet attention before walking toward the shoreline, carrying one of his professional audio recorders. He closed his eyes and stood perfectly still for several minutes, capturing nothing more than birdsong, rippling water, distant laughter, and wind moving through leaves. When he returned, I asked why those ordinary sounds mattered so much. He looked down at the recorder resting in his hands. "People always think memories are made of pictures," he said. "They forget that sound can bring an entire moment back to life. Someday you hear a screen door close, a train whistle, or rain hitting an old roof, and suddenly you are standing somewhere you have not seen in 20 years. His words settled over me with unexpected weight. I realized he had been collecting sounds the entire trip with almost obsessive care. Every diner, every overlook, every empty highway, every quiet morning before sunrise. They were not random recordings. They were pieces of time. That evening we finally reached the Pacific coast. The first glimpse of the ocean appeared suddenly beyond a winding curve, stretching endlessly beneath the fading light. Mason pulled onto a coastal overlook without saying a word. We climbed out and stood beside the railing while waves rolled steadily against dark rocks far below. The salty air carried the cries of distant gulls, and for several minutes neither of us spoke. It felt unnecessary. Some places seemed capable of speaking for themselves. Eventually Mason reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He looked at it for a long moment before carefully placing it back without unfolding it. I noticed the movement immediately. "More postcards?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "Not this time." "Then what is it?" He rested both hands on the weathered wooden railing and stared toward the horizon where the sun was slowly disappearing into the Pacific. "Just something I promised myself I would not read until we reached the last stop." I studied his face, searching for the playful grin that usually appeared whenever he avoided answering a question. It never came. Instead, I saw something I had never noticed before. Relief. Not the relief of someone escaping a burden, but of someone slowly reaching the place they had been trying to find for a very long time. Standing beside him with the ocean stretching endlessly before us, I realized the destination was no longer just a mystery. It had become a countdown, and every beautiful place we visited now felt less like the purpose of the journey and more like another page quietly turning toward an ending that neither of us could stop. 3 days later, the road no longer felt like a vacation. It felt like a thread pulling us toward something that had been waiting long before either of us climbed into the SUV. We followed the Pacific Coast Highway north through quiet fishing towns where weathered docks stretched into gray water and old lighthouses stood watch over restless waves. Every stop seemed carefully chosen, although Mason never admitted he had planned any of it. He simply turned off the highway whenever another overlooked place appeared, as though instinct alone guided him. I stopped asking where we were going because I had begun to understand that the destination mattered less to him than everything happening along the way. That afternoon, we reached a narrow coastal trail overlooking the ocean. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the steady rhythm of waves crashing below echoed against the cliffs. Mason carried one of his audio recorders while I held the disposable camera that now had only one photograph remaining. We walked in comfortable silence until we reached a weathered wooden bench facing the water. Someone had carved a simple message into the backrest years earlier. Hold on to the people who make ordinary days unforgettable. Mason ran his fingers gently across the faded letters before sitting down. Funny how strangers sometimes leave behind exactly the words you need, he said quietly. I sat beside him without answering. The wind tugged lightly at our jackets while gulls circled overhead. After several minutes, he finally broke the silence. Do you remember sophomore year when I almost transferred to California? I nodded immediately. Of course. You spent 2 months pretending it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Then you stayed. He smiled faintly. I never told you why. I turned toward him, surprised. You said the financial aid fell through. That was part of it. He looked toward the horizon instead of meeting my eyes. The bigger reason was that I realized every future I imagined somehow included calling you first whenever something happened. Good news. Bad news. It did not matter. Leaving suddenly felt like I was walking away from more than a school. His words settled heavily between us. I searched for the right response, but every sentence that came to mind felt incomplete. Before I could speak, Mason reached into his backpack and carefully removed the wooden box I had discovered days earlier. This time he placed it directly into my hands. I think you should have these now, he said. I looked at him in confusion. They are yours. He shook his head slowly. They were always meant for you. I opened the lid again, seeing the familiar stack of postcards waiting inside. At the very bottom rested a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in the same careful handwriting. My fingers instinctively reached for it, but Mason gently stopped me. Not yet. Please wait until tomorrow. Why tomorrow? Because tomorrow we reach the last place I needed to show you. His voice remained calm, but I could hear something fragile beneath it, like someone carefully balancing hope against fear. We stood together as the sun slowly lowered toward the Pacific, painting the water with long ribbons of gold. Without thinking, I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. It was the smallest gesture imaginable, something friends had done countless times before. Yet neither of us moved away. Mason closed his eyes for just a second before smiling with quiet gratitude. At that moment, I understood something that had been growing unnoticed since the first mile of this journey. Somewhere between forgotten diners, endless highways, shared motel rooms, impossible sunsets, and conversations that lingered long after they ended, my heart had quietly crossed a line my mind had been too cautious to acknowledge, and I suddenly realized I was no longer afraid of where this road might lead. I was only afraid that we were running out of it. The final morning arrived wrapped in a quiet mist that drifted across the coastline like the ocean was reluctant to let the day begin. Neither of us spoke much during breakfast. Even Mason, who could normally turn burnt toast into a 10-minute comedy routine, seemed content to let the silence exist. We drove along narrow coastal roads lined with tall pines until the pavement ended beside a weathered wooden gate overlooking the Atlantic. Beyond it stood a small cedar cottage facing the sea, its porch worn smooth by decades of wind and salt air. Mason parked the SUV and rested both hands on the steering wheel for a long moment before taking a slow breath. This is it, he said softly. We walked the remaining distance together. The cottage looked simple, almost forgotten, yet there was something deeply welcoming about it. Wildflowers surrounded the porch, an old wind chime swayed gently beneath the roof, and the sound of waves carried through every open space. Mason unlocked the front door with a key that looked nearly as old as the house itself. Inside, everything had been carefully preserved. Family photographs rested on the shelves. A faded quilt covered the sofa. A record player sat beside a bookshelf filled with novels whose pages had yellowed with time. Mason smiled as he slowly turned in the center of the room. My mother loved this place more than anywhere else in the world, he said. She always believed people needed one location that reminded them who they really were. After she passed away, I could never bring myself to come back alone. I listened quietly while he walked toward the large window overlooking the water. Then his smile faded. There is something else I should have told you before we ever left home. He reached into his backpack, removed a neatly folded medical folder, and handed it to me without saying another word. I looked down at the papers, recognizing medical terminology I did not fully understand except for one sentence highlighted across the top. Progressive hearing loss. My eyes moved back to him. He nodded slowly. The doctors discovered it several months ago. They cannot predict exactly how quickly it will happen, only that my hearing will continue changing over time. For someone whose entire career has been built around capturing sound, it felt like the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I wanted one last journey before fear convinced me to stop living the way I always had. I also knew there was only one person I wanted beside me for every mile of it. My throat tightened. All the unanswered phone calls, the hidden messages, the careful recordings, the postcards, the impossible urgency behind this trip suddenly fit together with heartbreaking clarity. "Why did you carry this alone?" I whispered. "Because I was afraid the diagnosis would become the only thing anyone could see when they looked at me. I did not want your sympathy. I wanted your company." We stood facing each other while the waves rolled steadily beyond the window. I realized there had never been a perfect moment waiting somewhere in the future. There had only been this one, and I had almost allowed it to pass without saying what had been growing inside me since long before this journey began. I stepped closer and looked directly into his eyes. "Mason, I need you to hear something while hearing is still something we can both take for granted." I thought I was protecting our friendship by keeping my feelings to myself. The truth is I have loved you for longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself. I was simply too afraid that saying it aloud might cost me the most important person in my life. Tears gathered in Mason's eyes as a quiet smile slowly returned. He reached for my hand, and I held his without hesitation. Neither of us needed another explanation. The ocean continued its endless conversation beyond the windows, and for the first time since the journey began, the silence between us held no unanswered questions at all. 1 year later, the cedar cottage no longer felt like the end of a journey. It had quietly become the place where every new chapter began. The porch had been repaired one board at a time. The weathered windows gleamed with fresh paint, and flower boxes overflowed with bright colors that Mason insisted attracted more birds than people. I never argued because, more often than not, he was right. We transformed the old storage room into a small recording studio unlike anything either of us had imagined before that trip. There were no flashing signs or expensive decorations. Only carefully arranged microphones, shelves filled with labeled sound archives, and large windows that remained open whenever the weather allowed the ocean breeze to drift inside. People traveled from nearby towns simply to preserve the sounds that mattered most to them. Parents recorded newborn laughter. Grandparents captured family stories. Musicians preserved the natural echoes of the coastline. Travelers collected the sound of waves before returning home. Every recording reminded us that memories were never meant to exist only inside photographs. They lived inside voices, footsteps, wind through pine trees, coffee cups resting on old wooden tables, and quiet conversations shared between people who believed there would always be another tomorrow. Mason still worked with audio every day, although differently than before. Some mornings, certain frequencies escaped him. Other days, he asked me to repeat a sentence that I knew he would once have heard effortlessly. We adapted without turning it into sadness. He learned new techniques. I learned to slow down, face him whenever I spoke, and appreciate every conversation instead of rushing through it. Life had not become perfect. It had simply become honest. One rainy afternoon, I finally opened the sealed envelope that had remained untouched since the journey ended. Inside was a handwritten letter dated several months before he had appeared outside my apartment with that impossible invitation. He wrote that if I was reading those words, then the trip had given him enough courage to stop hiding from both the future and his own heart. He admitted that every postcard had been written because he never found the bravery to send them. He confessed that every city he visited somehow reminded him of a story he wanted to tell me first. The final sentence made me smile through tears that arrived without warning. Home was never a place on the map. It was always the person I hoped would still answer when I called. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the wooden box beside the postcards where it belonged. That evening, Mason joined me on the porch, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. The sky glowed with soft shades of orange as the sun settled beyond the water, and the familiar wind chimes sang quietly above us. He noticed the open box resting beside my chair and smiled without asking whether I had finally read the letter. Some questions no longer needed answers. We sat together listening to the steady rhythm of waves meeting the shore until he nudged my shoulder with his own. "So," he said with the same crooked grin that had greeted me outside my apartment a year earlier, "where do you think we should drive next?" I laughed and looked toward the endless horizon that had once seemed like the edge of everything I knew. "Anywhere," I answered, "as long as we keep choosing the road together." He reached for my hand, and this time neither of us wondered what tomorrow might take away. We had learned that love was not measured by how long the road lasted, but by the quiet decision to keep traveling side by side for every mile that remained, wherever it happened to lead.